Alan Wake 2 has a story that can be quite complex to follow if you're not really paying attention throughout. It's a game that tells you what's going on at the start, but doesn't give you any hints as to how or why until very late on in the game's story, even being very cryptic at times. The images it shows you, the scenes and cutscenes, where it does actually tell you what they mean and leaves a lot down to interpretation. Well, in today's video, we will of course be discussing the ending of Alan Wake 2, talking about what it means and how I think there will be a third game, one that follows this, setting it up as a trilogy. I uploaded my full story explained video for Alan Wake 2 yesterday, so if you haven't checked it out already, I'll link it down below and on screen right now, but it's definitely worth a watch if you're interested in the game's story, and it does really go through everything with a bit of narration to guide you in the right direction as to what happens when. Let me know what you thought of the game and its story down below in the comments section if you've got it or not, or if you just watched my video yesterday and what you think of it there, and ultimately if you understand what's going on. I also do want to give a quick shout out to our new partnership with Control Freak that we've had on the channel now for a couple of weeks. I've been using these things for absolute years, and I've got to say I have them on every single controller that I own. It's way more comfortable to play on the thumbsticks using these things as well, especially if you like me in intense games like Alan Wake and you get sweaty hands, sweaty fingers, and your thumbs are slipping off the thumbsticks here and there. It's just really useful to have things like Control Freaks on, and they are so useful, and they just make everything much more comfortable as well. And if you're more of an FPS kind of player, like I used to play COD on the channel a lot, these are amazing for FPS and competitive players, and have been proven to increase KD by upwards of 26%. Along with a couple of copies of giving away Alan Wake when we hit the light goal, Control Freak were kind enough to send out a few of their Control Freaks as well, which I'll be pairing in with a few copies of those Alan Wakes that we do essentially give away. And if you want to go ahead and purchase your own, you can go and use the link in the description down below and use code Wizzo for 12% off all of your purchases as well. Thank you all for the support, everyone. But without further ado, everyone, let's dive straight into the ending explained for Alan Wake 2. So before we just delve straight into the ending, let's summarize the story a little bit, round up everything that we'd seen and make it clearer to understand when we come to explain the ending. If you're not too bothered about this part, then use the timestamps below to skip ahead, but I would definitely recommend sticking through this and just getting a recap of everything that's going on in a bit of a shorter story than a 2-hour video that I uploaded yesterday. But this will still be fairly detailed in terms of a summary, as there's a lot to cover in this game, so let's dive straight in. Alan Wake of course started back in 2010, where Alan, a famous novelist, visited a place called Bright Falls and followed a mystery that was set there. Throughout the story, Alan would learn more around this darkness, the dark place, and eventually find himself smack bang in the middle of all of it, eventually using something called a clicker to stop the darkness, subsequently trapping him in the dark place. 13 years later, two FBI agents, Saga Anderson and Alex Casey, were put on a case in an area specifically called Cauldron Lake, investigating a series of murders that happened around there. Multiple of these murders occurred back in 2010, however this new one caught the attention of the two PIs because of some similarities in the way the victims were murdered to the ones back in 2010. Bruising that showed signs of a struggle, markings tattooed on the victims, severe bloating as if they'd just emerged from a lake, and to the heart completely removed from the body. The murder victim they were looking into in this particular area was called Nightingale. He was an FBI agent who was fired back in 2010 when he went a bit crazy. He also arrived here back in 2010 and then went missing, just like Alan Wake. This was him appearing 13 years later looking like this. The question is though, what happened? It was throughout the journey of investigating what was going on here that Casey and Anderson found a series of pages all from what looked like a manuscript, a novel, something written describing their every move. This was shocking to the two PIs, as the first page they'd found described everything that had happened up until that point, that very point, the body, what they'd saw, even them finding this exact page. This wouldn't go on to be the first shock of the game either, with Saga finding another page deep inside the chest of the body of Nightingale, describing the death of Nightingale as well exactly. The page however described Nightingale to be hunting Saga, referring to him as a Taken. These pages were written all by Alan Wake, and they would go on to help Saga traverse her way through this story. The Taken were vulnerable to the light, the page said. They can't see anyone stood inside light. Nightingale without a heart, yet he's still killing. Saga initially thought this was some form of sick fantasy, until the sheriff tells Saga and Alex that he'd also come across a series of these pages. However, once he'd picked them up, the lights flickered and the sheriff disappeared, with then Nightingale sitting up and killing one of the officers. Saga does as the page says, stands in the light, and Nightingale walking around didn't see her. These pages, they were helping Saga, and she come to realise that. At this stage, this had turned into a little more than just a murder, with supernatural things occurring all around. Later that day, Saga and Alex found a body on the beach with another page lay beside the body. This person was Alan Wake. He was missing for 13 years and suddenly made his way onto the beach. How? Well, in this part of the summary, I kind of want to divide it into two sections here. There are two perspectives in this game. One is, of course, Alan Wake in the Dark Place, and the other is Saga Anderson in, we'll say, the Overworld. There's a place called the Overlap. This is where the Overworld and the Dark Place merge together, and also a place where Alan and Saga can sort of meet and communicate with one another. So let's start off with Alan Wake first, and then we'll go on to Saga's part of the story after we've covered that off, because it makes way more sense doing that. So, in 2010, Alan Wake was trapped in the Dark Place after he used the clicker to essentially keep the dark presence within the Dark Place. Alan's been trapped there ever since, and he has been for 13 years, but inside the Dark Place he hasn't just been sat around, he's been haunted and tormented by a dark presence that he refers to as Scratch. It became more and more apparent that Alan Wake's novels were actually impacting reality. A comment by Alex Casey was made, stating that Alex Casey was in fact a character written into one of Alan Wake's first novels called Departure. This of course was a coincidence. Alex Casey didn't know Alan, Alan didn't know Alex Casey. He was a fictional character written into a fictional novel, with a cult apparently sending Alex Casey different things to his actual home after they'd recreated these murders from Alan Wake's novels. Things were starting to become very real, things that Alan had written about in his books. This was essentially the story of Alan back in 2010, the horrors he witnessed during that time. However, the second book in the trilogy was called Initiation. This was a story around Alan Wake himself being trapped inside of a nightmare, desperately trying to find the manuscript to be able to get out of this nightmare called the Dark Place. Alan, however, doesn't remember writing this book. He has no recollection whatsoever, and that's because the Dark Place acts as some form of loop, so he will lose all of his memory when he goes back to the start, and that's of course what's been happening for the last 13 years. He can't remember what's been going on. Alan was consistently tormented by his dark, evil doppelganger, which was known as Scratch. Scratch wasn't a person, but a dark entity that would feed off of Wake, plague him and use him as a host to take over the world. That was the end goal. One way to do this would be to keep Alan Wake trapped inside the Dark Place and not let him out, not let him remember until Scratch is ready to strike. However, Scratch had a better idea this time. Wake trapped Scratch in this nightmare back in 2010 by using the clicker, so he needed to figure a way out. Why not escape with Alan Wake when he least expects it? Scratch let Alan Wake figure all of this out on his own. He let him traverse through the Dark Place, figure out for himself that he needs to rewrite the second manuscript. I've just got a subscriber. Let him figure out that he needs to rewrite the second manuscript Initiation himself. He needs to rewrite what goes on in that story, and eventually can write himself out of the Dark Place. The only issue is that Alan can't just completely change that manuscript. Alan has to amend it in a way that still stays true to the original, but just adjust the story slightly to allow him to get out. Wake finally figured this out, and found himself in the writer's room with a copy of the manuscript and sat down to amend it, scratching out his name. However, the Dark Place isn't a loop. I know we mentioned it was before, but hear me out here. There's not only one version of Alan Wake in this Dark Place. The Dark Place is almost like a spiral, so there are different versions of Alan at different points in time all around the Dark Place. An example here, later on into the game from a different point of time, Alan called himself on a payphone and started talking to him. and started talking to himself. This version of Alan was from the future, way further on into the story. We can also see Alan at this stage here, bursts into the writer's room and shoots another version of Alan who was amending the manuscript initiation from a different point in time, because Alan didn't understand who this was. He thought that this was Scratch writing it originally. The person that was making the amendments of the manuscript was in fact Alan. This was exactly what Scratch wanted, to turn Alan crazy, to make him angry and essentially do exactly this. Why? Well, Alan, who was writing this manuscript, the one that was killed, knew how to end all of this. He knew how to defeat Scratch. The clicker was the key, like it was back in 2010. This version of Alan added the clicker into the story initiation, meaning that once he obtained it, he could press it, leave the dark place, leaving Scratch behind. However, the present Alan burst in and shot him. That manuscript was not finished. Alan still had a lot to write, a lot to finish, different chapters to add in. Keep this part in your head because we're going to come back to this in Saga's side of the story shortly. The whole time playing as Alan was trying to get out to the dark place, but not only this, it was trying to prevent Scratch from getting out as well, and this is where the next book, Return, takes place and caps off the trilogy. Scratch, whilst possessing a version of Alan in the dark place, wrote a final novel called Return in a version of Alan that was possessed by Scratch, let's say. This was a horror story about how the darkness took over Bright Falls and eventually took over the rest of the world. Alan needed to get hold of this manuscript and change the story, amend it in a way like he did with Initiation that would prevent Scratch from taking over the world. He would need to write another chapter, one that would involve a hero of the story, someone that could do what was necessary outside of the dark place, and this of course was Saga Anderson. Saga Anderson was the hero of this story, but she didn't know that. All the pages she was finding on the ground were in fact a part of the manuscript from Return. She was reading her own story. It was helping her along the way. Like when the page told her to stand into the light. This was Wake writing about Saga, her story. However, in horror stories, there's only ever victims and monsters. There's never really a hero. So what it means is there needs to be a significant sacrifice because of the presence of a hero. Wake had to write Saga's daughter Logan and husband David into the story. Logan in the story drowned as a kid when she moved to Bright Falls with Saga, and David, well, they were divorced and he was left back at home. This wasn't in reality the situation, but as the story became more real, so did that situation. Saga would meet Wake in the overlap multiple times. He would tell her his progress, tell her about the clicker and what she needed to do on her side. She would eventually obtain the clicker. Remember earlier in the video, she would eventually obtain the clicker. But do you remember earlier on in the video I spoke about how Wake was writing Initiation and was shot by another version of himself because he thought he was Scratch? Well, it was at this very moment that Scratch possessed the version of Wake that shot Wake at the desk. And moments later, that version of Wake was transported to the beachfront, or should I say the lake, when Saga used the clicker. Scratch put himself inside of the head of that version of Alan Wake, and that version of Alan Wake was the one that was transported out of the dark place in the writing room into the lake bed. This was Scratch's plan all along, to get Wake to go a bit mad, almost want revenge for what he'd done, not only to Wake but also to his wife Alice, which we'll of course get to shortly, leading him to kill what he thought was Scratch, but in reality it was another version of Alan Wake. For Scratch to then plant himself inside Wake's head, the one alive at that moment in time, for him to leave the dark place and Wake to kick off the storyline of Return, when of course Saga pressed the clicker, Wake added it into the story. So when Saga used the clicker, nothing happened for her at that moment in time, but like a spiral, it caused Wake to initially appear on that beach, which was why he was so frantic when he woke up, and why he had a page next to him when he reached the overworld. Also, one of the reasons why he had such headaches throughout the entire game as well was he was in the overworld being interviewed by Saga and Alex, because Scratch never left. He was always there. watching, listening, and waiting for his opportunity. So during this part, Saga was able to blast Scratch out of Wake on the lakefront, but then he transferred himself into Alex Casey. Saga was thrown into the lake, which ultimately sent her into the dark place, and Wake, well, he was left behind on the lakefront to essentially fight it and to finish the fight himself. Wake had no choice but to enter the dark place and end all of this, and Saga had to find a way around the dark place as well, figuring out what everything meant. Scratch, however, now had the clicker, would go to Bright Falls and he would go and use it to start the story of the third manuscript return. However, when he dropped the clicker after using it, someone from the dark place reached up and grabbed it. This is some information you'll want to remember going forward, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a couple of minutes. There was a part of the story that I've not detailed just yet, and this was around Alan Wake's wife Alice. Alice plays a huge part in the story, but isn't a main character, and I think will be a very big presence in potentially a trilogy. Alice witnessed Wake's demise. He was overtaken by the darkness, by Scratch, and there was nothing to tell her of any of this happening. It just looked like Wake turning violent and vile on the outside when really it wasn't really his fault. Eventually, however, Wake made his way on his trip to Bright Falls and, well, he never returned. He was said to have drowned. Alice was struggling to cope with this, and whilst on her own, noticed things started to happen at night. Typewriter clicking, almost as if Wake was home in his office, and noises in the darkness. She decided to set up cameras all around the apartment to capture things on a motion sensor, and well, she captured some pretty chilling sights. Alice, however, in the end, gave up. She took her own life and wanted to live on through her art. This will be more important to remember come the ending. Wake and Saga both worked together to compile an ending suitable to the story, one that would save everyone, no deaths, but there would be a sacrifice involved somewhere. However, when Saga went into the dark place, the phone started to ring, didn't it? And when she spoke to the person on the other side, there was another woman on the line. Now, was this Saga another version of her in the future? I don't know. Similar to Wake potentially, as he was speaking to himself. But I don't think it was. Judging by the voice, I believe that this was Alice, Alan Wake's wife. Saga was directed towards a shoebox which contained the clicker and a light in the shape of a bullet. But how did the clicker get here? Did Scratch have it? Well, if you remember earlier on when I said someone grabbed the clicker when Scratch dropped it, I believe this was Alice. She grabbed it from the dark place and placed it at this point in time next to this statue in this shoebox with this light bullet essentially. This bullet of course would be to kill Scratch. Saga and Wake are both together in the writing room towards the end of the game with a final copy of Return formulated, and well, Saga shoots Wake in the head when Scratch is occupying it. Okay, so let's get to that ending. That summary was a bit longer than what I've expected, to be honest, when writing it, but it just shows there's so much in this game you need to take into account to understand the ending. So let's just dive in. The ending of Alan Wake 2 can be looked at in a couple of different ways. We of course have the final copy of Return, the deaths of Scratch. However, we still have Alex Casey and Saga Anderson in that room when the game ends. The first thing Saga does is call her husband David and kid Logan to see if they're okay, but she doesn't get an answer to what my knowledge or what we can hear in game. This could just be because she's in the dark place, as we know that from playing through the game, Alan and Saga both had problems connecting and speaking to each other from the dark place and the overworld, so that could be one of the reasons why, potentially, but we can't really confirm 100% right now. Wake also mentioned that there was a sacrifice needed, something that would happen if a hero was added to the story. If it's not death, could that sacrifice be Anderson and Casey stuck in the dark place like Wake was, just at a different point on the spiral? Well, all of this is well and good speculating about, but we kind of get a bit of a hint as to where the next game could go. Towards the very end of the game, because this final scene definitely hints at that. Take a watch at this, and let's talk about it after.
Part is just for you. After the haunting started, I got in touch with an organization that was still looking into what happened in Bright Falls. I went to their offices and something happened there. After I got home, I could suddenly remember everything. I remembered being trapped inside that lake. A dark ocean with echoes of myself. My fears, my photos. Inside a dark tide of madness. The same events and images looping again and again. And then I saw a light. Your light. You dove in just as I swam out. You never drowned. And you're still there reaching out. That is what the haunting is. I can see you because I've been there too. I chose to come back to the dark place. That is why I put on this exhibition. I had to mislead you so that I could get you to where you needed to be. The only way out of your loop is destruction or ascension. Light or dark. And we've covered the destruction part many times over. And we're getting to the ascension bit by bit. Time means nothing here. You'll still need to go through the loop. But I will keep showing you the images you need to see. The light you need to see. Until you're ready. Alan, I think we're getting close.
It's not a loop. It's a spiral.
Earlier on in the story, we were told that Alice was dead. She ended her own life and it all became too much for her, with her final image of her walking away, or what it seemed like anyway. This video goes on to tell us exactly what happened to Alice here. Alice was once in the dark place. The exact same thing happened to her that happened to Alan. What felt like a loop, the same thing over and over again, were happening to Alice. Until she saw a light. That light was Alan Wake, 13 years ago, when he went into the dark place to try and save his wife, Alice. When he went in, she came out exactly at the same time, and they pretty much passed each other on their ways. Alan never drowned like she thought that he did, because she didn't know what was underneath this lake, the dark place. But now, she knows. And this is where it gets a bit interesting here. Alice described her haunting earlier on in the game as hearing weird things at the night, typewriters clicking, almost like Alan was in his study. Well, that was Alan from the dark place writing his different manuscripts. What Alice thought was Scratch haunting her was in fact Alan in the dark place writing the manuscript Initiation and trying to get out of the dark place. All the pictures found in the apartment were of Alan coming to and from the Parliament building in the game in the dark place. That was the haunting that Alice was experiencing. Alan was haunting his wife without him knowing, or without them obviously knowing that that was the case. Alice could see things in the darkness because she's been there too. This is why she thought the haunting was the dark presence. Alice was coming out of the dark place and visited an organisation that looked into paranormal activity, specifically the one that happened in Bright Falls in 2010, the same organisation that intercepted the case from Saga in this game, the FDC. However, the next part of the video message hints to us that Alice was back in the dark place. She chose to go back in there. She was an artist and decided that she would put on an exhibition called The Dark Place, and this is what we saw when we visited the apartment with Alan in the dark place, and we would see it scattered all around the apartment. Now, this wasn't an exhibition, this wasn't an exhibit, this was Alice having to try and trick Alan to get him to where he needed to be. She misled him. However, it wasn't a bad thing that she did that. Alan needed to be in the writing room with Saga and Casey there helping him formulate this ending. The only way out of here is destruction or ascension, Alice says, light or dark. Destruction has been covered already, but ascension is still within reach. Alan, however, needs to go through this loop to get to where he needs to be. He needs to rewrite Initiation, and maybe even potentially a new book. Initiation could be finished at this point, his return is done, so maybe we're going to see a 4th iteration of a book, and that'll be Escape or something like that, or even be called Ascension. Alice, however, will continue to help Alan, giving him the images that he needs, the lights that he needs, until he's ready to ascend. It's at this point of the video where Alan wakes up and remembers. He's now starting to get it. The dark place isn't a loop as he initially expected, it's a spiral. As we said earlier on in the video, think of this as a staircase. Alan is at the bottom of the staircase right now, with other versions of himself further and further up as we go along. Alice has cracked the code and she is way ahead of it, potentially at the very top of the spiral staircase. She's helping Alan get to that stage, leaving him images, messages, pictures, objects every step of the way, and that is why we had different versions of Alan calling himself on the payphone. That version of Alan that called him is probably near the top of the spiral, whereas the present version that we were controlling was way down near the bottom. The version of Alice that was on the phone to Saga was potentially at the very top of the spiral staircase, whereas Saga was at the bottom. Do you see what I'm trying to get at here? Alan needs to find the right path by writing the right novel, and climb the spiral staircase until he reaches the top and is able to ascend out of the dark place. So what does this mean for the future of Alan Wake? Well, there's definitely going to be a 3rd if that's what you're asking, so I'd strap in everyone for an Alan Wake trilogy. But guys, that is everything you need to know about the Alan Wake 2 ending. The game is a lot to take in, man, but I'm hopeful that the summary of the game that I provided in this video, the ending as well, the sort of explanation to what's happened at the end, is enough for you to understand and kind of understand and get the gist of what the hell is going on in this game. But guys, I hope you have enjoyed today's video. Leave a like if you have. Let me know your thoughts and opinions are of Alan Wake 2 down below. Would you like a trilogy, or do you think they should stop it there and then? But it's been a pleasure as always, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Speak soon and take care.